are many who can be considered the greatest of all time.
Jon Jones.
But what happens when that legacy is marred by controversies and scandals? This video will explore the dark past of Jon Jones.
1 week before every fight, I would go out and I would get blacked out wasted.
I haven't wrecked my vehicle. I haven't been suspended. I didn't get stripped from my championship.
Hey, I don't know who you think you're playing with.
Okay, all right, lying.
Jon Jones tested positive. Jon gets arrested for a domestic dispute.
Scumbag, dude, you were just shooting guns, getting a DUI last week.
Before scandals, before alleged drug cheating, and before crimes to be committed, there was an up-and-coming athlete surging through the light heavyweight division. Within 4 months of his professional debut, not only had he amassed a 7-0 record, an unbelievable feat within itself, but his final fight of that brief 4-month period was his UFC debut. 7 wins, 6 finishes, 4 months. That fact alone serves as a microcosm of the greatness that was yet to follow. But as we have seen many times, it is often the darkness in life that breeds resilient men.
But I've also had times in my life where I've questioned religion. I had a sister who passed away. She was 18 years old. She had brain cancer. Within 2 years' time, her life was over. Considering that she was a light and she was my only sister, it was tough for me, despite all the questions that I've had. I've never given up on God, and I've never given up on my faith.
But with faith in God and belief within himself, he would continue toward championship gold.
And he might be the greatest talent that we've ever seen in the UFC.
So before we take a deep dive into Jon Jones's life, I want to take a quick moment to thank the sponsor of this video, Private Internet Access, who have massively helped support this channel and also provide a great discount to all of you. Ever had a problem with a YouTube video being geo-blocked? Well, this handy service can help remedy that by allowing you to change server to make it seem as if you're in another country, thus allowing you access to the video. On top of that, you can also get the most out of your Netflix catalog, and you can also keep your browsing safe wherever you are. It also works with all major streaming services, so you have unrestricted access to all of your favorite content anywhere in the world. Plus, it's one of the few VPNs that fully supports P2P, file sharing and torrenting. Unlike others, they don't store any logs or mess with your data, and if you wasn't already sold on how safe they are, their VPN is 100% open source and their code is public, so that anyone can take a look under the hood and examine just how secure and private their service really is. Almost no other VPN is this transparent and allow up to 10 devices and is available for all platforms: Windows, Mac, Android, Linux and iOS, and many more. With 24-hour support and a plethora of 5-star reviews and a 30-day money-back guarantee, you know that you're in safe hands. So if you want to stream more and stream better, head over to my link below to get this incredible service for just $2.03 per month for a 2-year plan with 4 months free. That's 83% off. And thank you once again to Private Internet Access for sponsoring today's video. Right, let's get back to it.
There's already been talk about Jon Jones being the greatest of all time when it comes to mixed martial arts. Is that something that you embrace? Is that something that you're ready for, or it still seems like it's a little ways off for you?
I believe it's a ways off, but I'm working towards making it true, and I believe that I'm on a path that I can control. to making it come true.
Perhaps in the face of all the odds, Jones would rise to become the champion of the light heavyweight division, the youngest champion of all time, a record that stands even to this day. With his career blemished with only one loss, disqualified for essentially beating a man too badly, and a ref's poor decision, one that is consistently disputed until this very day, Jones was perfect. And even as the gold strap was being cinched around his waist, the discussion quickly divulged into whether or not he was the greatest the sport had ever seen. Certainly his rise to the pinnacle of the sport spoke of some prowess and brilliance to come, but surely some title defenses were in order, and well, Jones wasn't willing to wait around. Later that year he would face former champion Quinton Jackson and become the first fighter to finish him, and then to round off the year he would defeat another former champion in Lyoto Machida. And so within just 3 years of participation in the sport, not only had he won the belt, but he had also dispatched 3 former champions. He would start 2012 with a win over former teammate and former champion Rashad Evans. His next fight, another former champion in Vitor Belfort, and finally his 5th title defense would come at the expense of the undisputed and undefeated Chael Sonnen. If you feel that I'm breezing through this lengthy and wonderful period of Jones's life, that's because I plan on making a detailed documentary on the origins of Jones. This story, however, is about something much darker and much more heinous, and so I'll let Jones foreshadow what the next 40 minutes will entail.
This journey that I'm on can go as far as I take it, and only I can mess it up. And I'm very aware of, guys like Mike Tyson and guys who were on such high pinnacles, and they messed it up. And I promised myself that I'm going to learn from athletes of the past and not go down the roads that they've gone down.
Jon Jones had torn through the competition, legend after legend, and top contender after top contender. The remarkable thing was, not a single one of his opponents gave him a challenge. Aside from a slick armbar attempt from Belfort, Jones was not only undefeated in his title run, but also dominant in every aspect of the sport. But there was a matchup looming that was unexpectedly about to test his resolve. The UFC would pair the young champion up against a rising star, hailing out of Stockholm, Sweden, a tall and offensive striker who, like Jones, had only dropped one fight in his pro career. But still, as the fight drew closer, people were not anticipating anything less than pure and unrivaled domination from Jon.
Jon Jones and Alexander Gustafsson for the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship of the World. First time in the UFC by Gustafsson. That's incredible. And there's a beautiful left hook. 47 and 49-46 for the winner by unanimous decision. And still the undisputed. And
so, tested to the absolute limits of his ability, Jones would still walk away the champion of the division, and perhaps even more likely, the greatest athlete the sport would ever know. Whilst the decision was controversial in many people's eyes, the fact was that memory of a robbery or a close fight would soon be weathered by the slow beat of time, ground to dust and scattered to the wind, a somber stream of meaningless gripes with a sport that ultimately elects one winner and one loser. Records are forever. The cacophony of supposed controversy would echo betwixt time till it fades to nothingness. Jones quickly moved on to defeat another rising talent from Brazil, Glover Teixeira, but it was yet another dominant victory notched into the belt, a footnote in Jones's deepening career. The question was there anyone out there to dethrone the youngest to claim gold, or was Jones on a path to transcend greatness? After Jones's dominant win over Glover, there were a few matchups that made sense. Dana White and the UFC wanted to pursue the match with Gustafsson, an obvious choice considering the controversial decision, and a fight that was guaranteed to sell tickets. Jones wasn't exactly interested though, and wanted to instead face Daniel Cormier, an undefeated heavyweight who had moved to the division because he was unwilling to step on the toes of his teammate Cain Velasquez, who was leading that division. And so Cormier, the 2-time Olympian, would drop down to light heavyweight to continue that undefeated streak, executing dominant victories over both Patrick Cummins and Dan Henderson. Despite what Jones wanted, the UFC got their way, and it was announced Jones would be defending his title against Alexander at UFC 178. But the universe had other plans for both Cormier and Jones, and set in motion circumstances that would fuel one of the greatest rivalries to ever take place in and outside of the octagon. Gustafsson would tear his meniscus shortly after the announcement, leaving two men to collide in what would be a bitter and heated rivalry.
Anytime you have a text from Lorenzo or Dana, you know it's like big news, something's going on. So I called him back. He said, give him a call. I called him back, and he offered me this fight. we got up front, I guess, in front of all the people, you know, you got a little hype and got in my face.
As me and Daniel were walking towards each other, I knew that it was going to be one of those face-offs when we got right into each other's faces. I just think we both acted really immaturely up there. You know, I think things just escalated way too fast.
I'm not afraid of Jon Jones in any way, shape, or form, so he's not going to come in there and try and bully me. That's not going to happen. You think he got under his skin? I'm not exactly sure if that's a good thing. Rashad got under his skin and got beat up, but I'm excited about fighting the best Jon Jones that there is. So if I had to kind of prod him a little bit to get him to train harder and be more committed, then so be it. I'm going to push that man to a place that he's never been in his entire life, and I will make Jon Jones quit. Sunday morning, Joe Rogan, you will wake up and you will say, how Daniel make this look so easy?
It's Jones's matchup with Cormier where things would begin to unfold for him, that thin veneer of a persona constantly threatening to break through from beneath the surface. The hate and bile that would spew forth from this matchup was unmatched in its acrimony and loathing, a bitter foundation to a rivalry that would go on to define the division.
Hey, pussy, are you still there?
I'm here. Yeah. I'm here. You're just the fakest person. I actually admire that you can actually be this fake. And like when the TV comes on, how you can just change. It's like you're a chameleon.
Hey, listen,
it's awesome.
I'm a professional.
It is unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
The fact that you're a pussy hasn't changed.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable how fake you can really be. Like, you are just such a fucking pussy. You're the fucking scum of the earth. You are a terrible human being, but you can sure turn it on, huh?
Thank you.
I wish they would let me next door so I could spit in your fucking face.
You know I would absolutely kill you if you ever did something like that.
You could never kill me.
Oh, I bet you I could.
When I'm beating your ass Saturday, show me on Saturday that I suck. Hey, show me I suck.
You suck.
All three judges score the contest. 49-46 for the winner by unanimous decision, and still the undisputed UFC light.
I do not like DC, and this is why I'm being this way.
Congratulations on retaining your title. Jon Jones, ladies and gentlemen.
I know it's always nice to be a class act after a victory, but I really hope he's somewhere crying, you know, and I'm sure he is.
This is not going to ruin me, you know, one way or the other. I'm going to stand across the cage from that man again, and I'll believe just as I did tonight, and I'll take the fight to him again, I guess.
And last, how do you feel?
It's just so hard for me because Jon Jones is so young and has so many more things to accomplish, but he's beat the who's who, he's cleaned out the division, he's breaking records, and if this continues, yeah, probably the greatest ever.
Jon Jones has been stripped of his UFC light heavyweight title.
Crashed into a car carrying a pregnant woman, then ran from the scene.
I'm joined by Daniel Cormier, who takes on Anthony Rumble Johnson this Saturday night at UFC 187 for that 205-pound strap.
With Jones removed from the sport indefinitely and stripped of his title for his hit and run into a pregnant lady, it gave way for a new champion to rise out of Jon's failures. The question was, would the division move on, or would it be trapped under the suffocating hold Jones's ghost held over it?
First time since 2011, a man other than Jon Jones will be called champion at 205.
He's gonna tap.
It is all over! Daniel Cormier is the new UFC light heavyweight champion!
Joe Rogan, no disrespect to you or the 16,000 people in this arena, but I have a message for one man. Jon Jones, get your shit together, I'm waiting for you.
For most fans, Jones being stripped of the title was the first indication that perhaps the persona that he had been displaying to the public was in fact a charade, a display of false integrity. But for those who had been paying attention, the warning signs were there previously. From arrogance to DUIs, Jones's real problems were simply lurking beneath the surface. For all intent and purposes, it was a complete PR disaster. From losing sponsorships to forced community service, Jones was in a world of problems. But rebuilding that, guys, was the main objective over his year-long suspension. It started with public appearances as part of his community service, giving speeches and lectures around schools, talking about his rise as a champion, to the problems he faced today, teaching children to chase their dreams, but to also not fall victim to the burden that chasing goals can bring. For what it's worth, Jones's talks are actually very special. The way he communicates to the children is eye-opening to the man Jones had the potential to be.
To become a UFC fighter, I had to first start by having a dream. My dream was to be a fighter. And in order to make that dream come true, I had to figure out how to set goals and how to accomplish goals. So some of my goals were to make sure that I eat really healthy. Some of my goals was make sure that I went to bed early so that I would have energy to train. My goals were to make sure that I studied as best as I can.
Amongst this hiatus, Jones would also partake in an interview with MMA fighting, and it seemed like Jones was ready to learn from his mistake and to also embrace sobriety, believing that it would mean the best years of his career and life were ahead of him.
Yeah, the whole situation has really been a blessing for me. My life has changed for the better in so many different ways since this car accident. I'm grateful for it. I believe my best is yet to come in business, my career, as a husband, as a father. I think my best is yet to come. And I honestly have a feeling that things are going to be better now than they were before because of my outlook on life and some of the things I've been through. No, I don't drink anymore.
How long has it been?
It has been maybe three or 4 months now.
Is it difficult?
It's not difficult, man. I'm honestly, I'm excited to be set free from that. You know, it took me a long time to acknowledge that I had a little bit of a problem. But now that I'm completely sober, I totally had a problem. And I'm upset about all the hours I spent being under the influence and all the dollars I spent getting under the influence. You know, throughout my whole career, everybody said to me, John, what would happen if you didn't drink, you didn't smoke? Imagine how great you could be. And now I'm excited to see.
How many more years do you want to fight for?
Man, honestly, now that I am sober, I honestly believe I just added a few more years of longevity to my career, so.
The question was, could Jones recover from this? Hitting and running from a car crash involving a pregnant lady was just, well, terrible, there's no other way to put it. But Jones choosing to be selective about his public appearances and interviews was probably the best move. People move on fast, and most fans of the sport were probably looking at a hazy rearview mirror when it came to Jones's problems outside of the cage. In the background of this, Cormier would have another chance to defend his title at UFC 192, this time against Alexander Gustafsson, who had quite rightly deserved a shot at gold. It was a barn burner of a fight, but ultimately Gustafsson would miss championship glory by mere millimeters again, losing via split decision, Cormier retaining his title.
And still, the undisputed
Time had drawn to a close on Jones' suspension at this point, and UFC 197 would usher Jones back to the sport, provided with the opportunity to reclaim his title from his rival. But 3 weeks before the bout was to take place, Cormier would pull from the event, citing a foot injury, leaving Ovince St. Preux to step in at short notice to face Jones for the interim title.
Champion, Jon Jones!
Whilst many would claim that the title fight was one of Jones's worst performances considering the level of competition, the results said differently, with Jones winning every single round and ultimately the interim title. On his exit from the octagon, he would take time to make Cormier aware that he was coming for him. The UFC quickly put the failed matchup together for UFC 200, a massive event with everyone from Conor McGregor, Jose Aldo to Brock Lesnar taking part. And if you thought for one moment that time would have healed things between Jones and Cormier, you would be buying into a fallacy. They would spit venom right up until fight week, but fate was about to strike out once more in an unexpected way.
The hatred comes from him. It stemmed from him from the very beginning.
It makes no sense to me. I don't understand how a guy can be so focused in one area and be willing to throw everything away with the other hand.
He's looking at his superior, and he just can't handle it.
Superior? You have lost your mind, son.
Yeah.
You have lost your mind.
Yeah, you know, I think I focus so much on being the best as a martial artist, I let my character slide.
I will die to beat you. Know that.
All right. Be prepared to do that.
His history dictates and determines that the same thing is going to happen. That is his character, that is him at his core. I look at that young lady, the PR lady that's on his team now, and I see in her eyes, she knows she's fighting a losing battle. I see that these guys know that this kid will not change. He will not change. He's the same guy. He's rotten at his core, and he will continue to up.
Don't you think that people can learn from their mistakes?
Mistakes? Mistakes. You don't constantly make mistakes.
The UFC organization was notified tonight that the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency has informed Jon Jones of a potential anti-doping policy violation.
Daniel Cormier, I want to apologize to Daniel Cormier. I know that this fight means a lot to him.
Very disappointed. I've worked really hard to prepare for this, and
a sigh that says more than any words ever could. Exhausted from the emotional barrage of preparing for a fight, only for fate to have it dissipate at the behest of a failed drug test. It's easy to empathise with Daniel in this situation, but he wasn't the only one tired of Jones's controversies, rearing their head to ruin the sport. So were the fans. And as one of the best cards of the year fractured and crumbled, Daniel was left to face late replacement fighter Anderson Silva, who had gone to defeat by unanimous decision in a non-title fight. Throughout the whole proceedings, Jones would maintain his innocence, blaming it on a contaminated Cialis pill.
So I took an off-brand Cialis pill.
Off-brand?
It wasn't actual Cialis, but it was described to me as being a Cialis, and so I thought it was a Cialis, and I just took it. So
why does a guy like you need Cialis?
I have a huge cock, Joe.
And upon further investigation and analysis by USADA, they would deem this statement to be accurate. Regardless, Cormier's utterances about Jones echoed from the past. Everywhere he goes, trouble follows him. And whilst his suspension was ultimately levelled at just a singular year with respect to a contaminated substance, it would provide time for Cormier to enter the cage to defend his title.
And still, the undisputed UFC.
Now, also in the room, of course, is Jon Jones.
Who? When you get your together and you're ready to fight, I'm here waiting for you, young man. You know it. I've been waiting for 2 years.
In cyclical fashion, Daniel would use the post-fight interview to beckon Jones back to the sport as he neared the conclusion of his suspension. It was clearly the fight everyone wanted, from Jones to the fans to Dana White. That resentment and bitterness had only intensified when separated from each other. Cormier with more reason than most to be fatigued from the disappointment of rigorous training camps, resulting in either no fight or injury. That anticipation to get back the only loss on his record was about to spew out in the press conference, announcing Jones's return to the sport and their fated second matchup.
In Anaheim, California, the monster that is UFC 214, Cormier versus Jones.
Back in front of a UFC audience, have had a lot of time away from the sport, a lot of time to reflect on, you know, how much this MMA career means to me. I messed up outside of the octagon. I got that taken away from me, but the guy's never beaten me. In order to be the champion, you have to beat the champion. He can fight all the other light heavyweights that he wants. He can beat every light heavyweight until he beats me. That belt over there is a piece of shit.
You just said he's back, right? But is he back? Doesn't he have 2 more months of suspension?
Yeah, exactly.
Is he back?
I'm sitting here and I see him. He's over there. Is this guy gonna mess this up again by doing steroids or snorting cocaine or sandblasting prostitutes? What's this guy gonna do? What's this guy gonna do to mess this up this time?
Despite Cormier's worries, Jones would make it to the fight. Well, kind of.
The wait is over. Jon Jones is back for the first time since April of 2016. Looked like he knocked the mouthpiece out.
He did.
He's out. Jon Jones has done it. How about it?
Wow.
Declaring the winner by knockout. And now,
if you win both fights, there is no rivalry, so I don't know.
I tell you what, man, anybody at home let yourself down, you let your family down, you let your peers down, your coworkers down, you let yourself down, it's never over.
Weeks away from your last fight, how are you feeling?
You know, it takes time to get over something that's so big, especially when you're unsuccessful in such a big event. But, you know, day by day you get better. You keep fighting, you keep learning that there are things that are much more important than the competition, and you got to try to get through it.
I would definitely like to have a respectful relationship with Cormier.
Breaking news here on SportsCenter. Jones failed a drug test at UFC 214.
Jon Jones tested positive for turinabol from a sample the day before your guys' fight, of course, at UFC 214 in July.
You know, the championship is getting returned to you. The fight is a no contest. If he cheated, he could not have fought and cheated and still won the fight. So, once again, I'm the UFC champion.
Up any possible scenario for what happened?
No, he tweeted out like, "This is when I find out who my real friends are." #blessed.
Oh boy.
Fuck that noise.
That sounds like you're feeling sorry for
Jesus
yourself.
ain't helping me out this one.
At 2 minutes of round number 2. Declared the winner by TKO and still the undisputed UFC.
As Jon Jones was sidelined for the third time in his career, it allowed Cormier to ascend to the throne once more. Mirror images of each other slumped on the canvas floor in victory, one with a haunting secret, and the other struggling with the remnants of his past. And whilst for Cormier it should have been one of the greatest moments of his career, returning to the top, it was clouded by that shadow creeping over him, the haunting visage of his greatest rival. But Cormier was about to prove what he was capable of, free from the clutches of Jones. Cormier was about to show what it meant to be a real champion, a true ambassador for the sport.
Daniel Cormier trying to leave here with a piece of unprecedented UFC history.
Jones and Cormier's rivalry will forever define the light heavyweight division, as their paths to greatness fluttered in and out of orbit with one another. Their meetings inside the octagon cemented as some of the greatest and entertaining the sport will ever know, yet their aftermaths would be mutilated in one way or another by Jones's transgressions outside of the cage. Those indiscretions left Cormier with heartbreak, agony and frustration, the bitter pill to swallow of losing to a man that not only disrespected the sport, but also cheated in order to gain the advantage, the ramifications of which remain a haunting nightmare to plague Cormier for the rest of his life.
So Jon Jones in 2017 fights me in Anaheim, wins the fight, gets that new champion, from beating me. They find out he tests positive for steroids. They say, oh man, he's suspended for 18 months. Now you get 18 months, still got your money, right? You're still only 25 years old, 26 years old. I'm 37, 38 years old. And you're 27. You get a year off. It's like it's horrible, but it's like, so it's easy for him to say that water under the bridge. But for me, it's like, man, you did some stuff to my career that never let me settle, because now I don't know. It's like, I can know through the fights that, yeah, man, maybe this dude was just better than me. But I also know that if you're not doing the things that aren't boosting you, can you really work to the level that I'm working?
What a bleak and wretched burden to bear. Cormier, a victim of an athlete's obsession with being the greatest, and it called into question the lengths Jon was willing to go in order to remain at the top. But with Jones removed from the picture for at least 18 months, it gave a chance for Cormier to reinstate himself as the champion, and not only that, but also move up to the division he was undefeated in previously, and put down the winningest champion in UFC heavyweight history, Stipe, and become a double UFC champion. He would also go on to defend his heavyweight title against Derek Lewis. It's that pervasive sense of what if. Clearly, Cormier was the greatest outside of Jones, but when we critically look at history, regardless of when USADA caught Jones, I think it's obvious that we can disregard anything Jon had ever done inside of the cage. His legacy, a mound of ash, the scorched remains of a record destroyed in the flames of lies, cheating and dishonor. That's why, to me, Cormier features so heavily in this documentary. He is what the light heavyweight division should be remembered for, and whilst it may be cheap to say, Cormier is the good to Jones's evil, polar opposites. And just a month after solidifying his reign as a double champion, he would vacate his light heavyweight title in December of 2018, favouring to stay at heavyweight, the cut proving to be too much to make in the latter half of his career. With nothing else to prove in the division, he would attempt to move past the lingering shade of Jones, who was still sidelined awaiting his imminent couldn't come back to the sport after his third lengthy suspension. It's a fitting end to the conflict, Daniel in the driver's seat, ending it on his terms, as Jones sat discarded for his wrongdoings. With the title vacant and Jones free once more from suspension, the UFC put together a long-anticipated rematch to claim the light heavyweight throne, Jones vs Gustafsson 2. Jon had shied away from the media for the last year and a half, and it made sense. There was a lengthy process to undergo with USADA, and allowing the relevant information to come out from an official source made sense. Many people wondered why Jones only got an 18-month suspension, and there were a couple of reasons as to why this happened. Firstly, he provided substantial assistance to USADA. Substantial assistance is in reference to an athlete informing an anti-doping agency about a doping violation of another athlete. I went through the records of people who were subsequently caught by USADA and couldn't find anyone that had a meaningful connection to Jones, so my guess is it was something larger than individuals in particular. And secondly, Brett Okamoto would confirm that Jones' reduced sentence was due to the fact that he had no intention to actively cheat, even though no contaminated substance were confirmed. Regardless, the UFC were more than willing to put the three-time strip champion back onto the roster and onto a headlining spot of a pay-per-view, literally within weeks of his suspension ending. And well, the whole scandal was about to get even worse.
Dana, as I've been told, you have an update on the card this weekend scheduled for Las Vegas.
We're moving it from Las Vegas to the Forum in LA. I'll turn it over to Jeff to explain what's going on.
We were informed earlier this week by the United States Anti-Doping Agency, who administers our anti-doping program, that a urine sample collected from Jon Jones on December 9th of this year tested positive for a very, very small amount of a long-term metabolite.
All the experts say you couldn't possibly take the amounts that Jon Jones, it's impossible.
No evidence of any readmission. It likely came before the last one, July 2017, and zero evidence that it's performance enhancing.
See, the Jon Jones situation is very tricky because he's so good and he's so dominant that people just assume that he's been doing something his whole career.
Do you believe Jon Jones is a cheater?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Half the people that are judging me haven't opened a chemistry book since high school. It's good that you actually believe that a microscopic pictogram somehow has allowed me to become more confident.
Despite the huge mess around changing venues at a few days' notice because the Nevada State Athletic Commission refused to allow Jones to fight in Las Vegas, the matchup would still go ahead as planned, but it was yet another reminder that no matter what he does, no matter where he goes, trouble clings to him. And as a fan of the sport, it was almost funny that situations like this were still happening. But the machine would keep on turning, and Saturday night would roll around, providing the opportunity for a new man to sit atop the throne where Cormier had once been.
Referee Mike Beltran has called a stop to this contest at 2 minutes, 2 seconds of round number 3, declaring the winner by knockout and new undisputed.
And with that, Jones decisively claimed back his title, and almost out of spite to the fact that he had been out of the game for so long, he would become one of the most active champions in the UFC over the course of the next 2 years.
What's the message for the rest of the 205 now that you're back on top?
Man, they already know what the message is. They already know what the message is. And whoever's next is going to be next.
You got to realize that division is super ultra competitive, right? Unless Jon Jones is in the mix. Then it's not competitive. Yeah. Jon Jones dominates everybody.
And a lot of big championship upsets in UFC history. Matt Serra, Holly Holm come to mind. Anthony Smith looking to join that club. Putting his all-time great status on the line every time he competes.
48, 47 for the winner. And still the undisputed.
18th straight title fight for Jon Jones dating to March of 2011.
Unanimous decision.
But for Jon, you look at his legacy and the legends that he's fought, it's tough for him to get up for the challenge. So he's playing with his food right now.
Well,
wait till he fights. I'm telling you, wait till he goes to heavyweight. You're going to see the old Jon, where he thinks it's a challenge. Wait till you see him fight a Stipe or Francis.
Unlike the past few years of his life, the fights, the matchups and the decisions were all rather uneventful. Jones came back to the sport in what should have been a defining period of the company, the greatest athlete wearing the crown again. But for me, the cards felt so empty and unmemorable. The fact that he was meant to be one of the most dominant and the competition felt so inadequate and he was still coasting to decisions was just so uninspiring. The last one of which, against Dominic Reyes, he probably didn't deserve to win either way. The division just felt stale. Fans yearned and pined for the years where he and Daniel trash talked each other, threatening to spit in each other's faces, because it was just entertaining. It was rivalries that the sport was built on. Tito and Chuck, Nate and Connor, Cruz and Faber, these were the storylines that had people's eyes glued to the screen. Even Jones's problems outside of the cage weren't a spectacle anymore, because, well, of course he was still breaking the law. From assaulting a cocktail waitress to drinking and driving and discharging firearms in public, the man was still at it. It just wasn't a surprise anymore. All the interviews in which he discussed being a changed man, being graced by God's lessons and maturing into a better person were just fabrications of either his ego denying his reality or his PR team, and no amount of policing riots or charity work was about to fix it. If there is one thing, then it's hard to be a Jon Jones fan, and in a lot of ways I empathise with his situation. He dropped out of college to earn money to raise his family and to chase an impossible goal. It turned out that not only was he great at the sport, but he was the greatest of all time, the youngest UFC champion, the legend killer, the most dominant. Being thrust into that position from such an early age can be so corrupting, but you just simply cannot justify the lengths he went to protect his legacy. His actions outside of the cage are not becoming of an athlete and public figure who is meant to inspire younger generations. It's hard to understand his situation, and I think we are probably blessed not to have lived his life. From a troubling childhood to alcoholism to substance misuse, it's not like he's having a good time. The fact that he has such a loving and loyal family around him is probably his only saving grace. I see a man struggling with success, with fame and his own real and palpable greatness, and it's just kind of sad. And as much as this story is about Jones, it is also Cormier. In the background of Jones's most recent title run, Cormier would drop the rematch to Stipe at UFC 241 in August of 2019, and also the rubber match a year later at UFC 252. In the post-fight interview, Cormier would bow out of the sport at age 41, with a professional career sitting at 22-3, losing only to the greatest heavyweight and greatest light heavyweight the UFC has ever known, Stipe and Jones respectively. Daniel's career was an unending waltz in the cage with the greats of the sport, a story interwoven with championship gold, epic rivalries, and most importantly, eminence. He etched into the history books with blood, sweat and tears his name, and as time erodes and weathers the stinging reminder of his brushes with Jones and Stipe, he will go down as one of the greatest champions to ever grace the sport. He left MMA as an athlete to strive toward, to look up to and be inspired by, and if we disregard records and look at what it means to have the spirit of a champion, Daniel might just be the greatest light heavyweight to have ever claimed the title, because in a time when the division needed a leader who didn't treat the sport with disdain, he carried the belt with integrity, and despite being knocked to the canvas by a cheater, he arose with grace and dignity, with honour and respect, and continued to push on in the face of adversity. He turned public opinion of himself from a cacophony of boos to a thunderous shower of cheers and claps. That to me is what it means to be the greatest of all time. And as the spotlight shone its brightest upon Cormier's final performance, Jones would not let the public be enamoured or grateful for this curtain call, and in some twisted sense of jealousy and spite, 3 days after Daniel's retirement, Jones would officially announce the relinquishment of his light heavyweight title, knowing full well that this would detract from Cormier's exit.
Jon Jones announced he was vacating the light heavyweight title. Is that official?
It's official, yeah.
Okay.
So I actually, tonight while we were here, I went live on SportsCenter in between one of the fights and announced all that.
Jon then said, negotiations starting with you guys about heavyweight. Is that true? Could that be his next move?
Well, I know that Jon right now wants to take time and do things that he wants to do. You know, living his life a little bit. And I think when this whole heavyweight thing plays out, we'll see what works for him.
Do you want to fight soon?
No, I don't want to fight soon. I don't want to fight soon. I have no interest in fighting in the UFC until I get paid what I believe I'm worth. I think that I'm even more beatable as a heavyweight. And that's why I went to Dana White looking for a raise. Daniel Cormier got a raise when he went heavyweight. I was looking for a raise to go heavyweight. Francis Ngannou is scary.
You know,
he is.
there's a big chance that he could break my jaw.
It was also in this interview that Jones would discuss what a loss would mean to him, and he would say something regarding steroid accusations and defeat that really just makes me want to be a Jon Jones fan.
Wrap your head around a loss, that's the question.
I feel like I have taken losses throughout my whole adult life publicly. To be accused of steroids, you go from hero to zero immediately in some people's eyes. And even though USADA has proven that there's a reason for those picograms, and picograms gives you zero athletic performance.
You've never looked like a guy who's on steroids.
And even though I'm viewed as a steroid user in some people's eyes for the rest of my life, which hurts me deeply, honestly. That's a defeat. You know, I lost my mom. You know, that's a defeat. I lost my sister to cancer. That's a defeat.
This right here is a win.
a hit and run against a pregnant woman. Humiliating, and just you're looked at as a monster. You know, to be involved with something like that, that's a defeat.
I think that sometimes it's easy to get swept in or swayed by the overwhelming tide of public opinion, and sometimes it's hard to remain level-headed. I don't know where I sit on athletes and PED usage. A lot of me wants to say, of course they're all using it. How could you be at the top echelon of the sport without it? But there is this other side that wants me to believe people like Jones. I honestly don't know what to think. I've said what I've said in this video already, and a lot of it's just my opinion, but I also want to say that I hope he's telling the truth, and that whilst ultimately I'll never know, it's strange to look at the other side of this potential story. How unlucky this man truly is. I mean, from a scientific and legal standpoint, USADA have already cleared him twice. Anything you read on the internet as far as Jeff Novitzky is concerned is just speculation. In fact, anything I've insinuated into this video up to this point is just that. Speculation. It's just a thought that this man might in fact be living a nightmare, his belt taken from him twice for something he never did. But with all of that said, Jones would take his leave from the sport, awaiting the return to heavyweight for a chance at becoming a 2-division champion and to be paid what he felt he was worth. Jon Jones's story is that of a man with some ethereal darkness that has twisted and spliced into his very being. A man struggling with greatness, with ego, and with fame. And perhaps the saddest part of it is that it's something he is cognizant of, his mistakes shimmering lights beckoning him to change. The call doesn't go unanswered, it's just that he misses the mark. And as his legacy continues to deepen, the fissures in his personal life threaten to swallow it whole. And nothing could be more cynical or ironic than his induction into the Hall of Fame. A moment of honor and pride for most, but for Jones it would serve as a microcosm of that plague that had followed his career eternal.
Jon Jones, UFC Hall of Famer. How does that sound to you?
It feels really cool. I feel in better shape now than I've ever did before. I'm sleeping better, eating better, drinking less alcohol, and I feel really good. Yeah, fighting for the title is what I want the most. Yeah, for sure.
We're in a really good spot, myself in the UFC. We're talking about fighting next year.
Thank you all so very much. Welcome to the Park Theater here in Las Vegas for the 2020 Hall of Fame induction ceremony. I'm John Anik.
With Alexander Gustafsson was one of the toughest things I had to do in my years, both mentally and physically. It was only 25 minutes, but the 4th and 5th round, I pulled from something that I didn't know I had inside of me. And forever now I do know what I'm like when things get tough. I think adversity is very important for all of us, and I just appreciate Alex for making me a better man for the rest of my life.
Domestic violence call. Female is bleeding from the nose and mouth.
And they ultimately arrested Jon for misdemeanor battery, domestic violence, and injuring and tampering with a vehicle.
See how this plays out legally for him and where this ends up going.
The child who was there said to the security guard, "Will you call the police?" That's heartbreaking.
It's like it's not even shocking anymore. It's when we bring him here, it's almost expected. You know, you can't even get him in Las Vegas for less than 12 hours to induct him into the Hall of Fame. It's a problem.
Good and evil.